We have one thing on the agenda, and this is the continuing of the types of change. I did already talk about access issues, and I also wanted to just sort of have an ongoing segment right at the beginning to check in with everyone and see if there's some additional topics that folks are interested in seeing covered in the group. I know that as we go along, some thoughts are going to come up of things you might want to spend a little more time on. So I've got a section in each meeting now that's going to sort of capture that. So I'd like to just open it up and see if there is something that folks would like to talk about in a future meeting. For instance, last time we brought up notifications. If an institution had put something out themselves to try and use something and they wanted to know when it became available through the authority.
My question is, I think it's related to a topic or a subtopic, and the sense of change management and thinking about infrastructure and the various related things about making this move over the whatever term it takes to make this move in the various increments. My question has to do with diagramming. I think a topic may be the values of diagramming, or what we think about diagramming as a way of talking about infrastructure changes, and if that can be informative to people from a sheerly pedagogical pedagogical element. Not just abstractions, but visual representations. There's pros and cons, but I'm just wondering if that's a thing that could be drawn up using maybe some standard tools now. As we could work on it together or whatever. I'm just wondering about it as a possible topic, if that's something that we could get into later on. Talk about like where data is being produced, where it's going, where it's being stored, related to notifications, related to all kinds of issues that we're already discussing. But I feel like the diagramming may be an element of that. Is that a subtopic or a topic in itself?
I certainly think we could talk about that. I will put that on the future topics list. I don't know if that is, it seems like one more way of sort of expressing information about how things are happening. And I know that some people process information more visually and some people process information through reading. So that would be one more way to do that. Anyone else before we move on? I do have a request for the group. Can someone take on the responsibility of identifying the attendees and absentees from today's meeting so that we can capture who was available for our discussion today?
Yeah, I can do that.
Thank you.
No worries.
I thought I would do just a little bit of a summary from last time. We talked about changes with labels, and the part I wanted to focus in on, I will comment first, like last week when we looked at this was in a table format. We had a very full discussion, and I just felt like that format was not amenable to capturing all the information that was coming up in the meeting. So I did change things around. This is the same page we worked on last time. It's just now there is a section for each of the types, and a basic description, our discussion we had last week, and then sort of trying to bring that down to a summary of like, what are the approaches we talked about, giving some potential examples of data streams that could come from that. The one piece I did pull out that was very interesting to me at the end of our conversation was some of the challenges we identified. And I don't think it just applies to the labels. I think it applies to all the various types. And one challenge was that if we're talking about linked data, then you don't necessarily have a simple expression of that label. For example, it's not just necessarily URI, predicate, and label. It could go through many other URIs with other predicates so that you actually have to traverse the graph several steps before you actually get to the label. And some of those may be through URIs, some may be through blank nodes. The original way we express this with a URI, a label, and a predicate may not be sufficient. That predicate may not be sufficient as a way to express that. There is something called LD path, which gives sort of like an XPath type expression to how you traverse a graph. And perhaps instead of predicate, that should be an LD path. One of the other challenges that we expressed last time for labels was that what constitutes a label may change between authorities or ontologies. And the common scenarios where there may be just a primary label, a single one, or there may be multiple primary labels. That was like the Wikidata, where they have a primary label in each language. There may be a primary label and lots of variant labels, or the primary label may not be human readable. And the example there was ISNI, where the ISNI number itself is the primary label. And, or there may not be a label of any kind. And the last one that I actually didn't put in here that was on my mind was that we seem to be having like 3 audiences who's processing the change management stuff. And that is, we have like a full cache where it's fully processed by a computer, a machine. There's no human interaction with that. We have partial caches where maybe it is just the label that's cached, or maybe just a small subset of that. And maybe that can be fully processed by a machine, but maybe there needs to be some human intervention. And then the last was that I'm a human and there's only certain pieces of changes that are pertinent to me, and I want to be able to quickly look through that change management data and see which pieces jump out at me. So I wonder if others have some challenges that they remembered from last time that would be added to this.
So you're asking about whether or not we can get some kind of informational piece that says this has changed, the label has changed, primary label has changed, variant label has changed, or one has been deleted, etc. You're asking for that specifically in the triples, not like really you talk about like is that really what you mean? I'm trying to make sure I understand what we are now. Sorry.
Yeah, so I was just trying to think through some of the stuff that we talked about last time and pull out some of the challenges that we have so that we can look at whether or not what we've expressed is sufficient to capture that information. For example, that first challenge I gave, the label may not be directly connected to the subject URI, then the question is, do we need to replace predicate with something like LD path? And I just didn't know, since last time, if folks have thought through this more and have some other thoughts on how this might need to be expressed.
I have a quick question, and it goes to our issue that we mentioned about when we're trying to show updates, and we know that the diff requires a hierarchical order, and we don't have that ordered. I wonder if the sheer existence, or in this case, the signifier of a deletion, whether or not it was ordered, could be fundamentally still valuable. Like it wouldn't even matter. Almost, it's just a very kind of abstract question or a general question. Like, is it possible that the sheer existence of, like, say, green for add, irrespective of where it is, and a deletion for something that was removed, irrespective of where it is also still helpful information for us? What do we think about that? Even though it's not like strictly related to a file in the flat sense.
I didn't fully follow that, Jesse. Can you say that one more time? And then,
indeed, yeah. The question has to do with when we're looking at the differences, and Dave really kind of responded to David really responded to this, I think, in the last meeting. But it had to do with when we're looking at a diff in the sort of like the GitHub sense. We do see the idea of a file being changed, deletions or things added, and so there's an order to it which we don't have in the graph. So my question would have to do whether or not there's still a graph. So the graph has been added to and or deleted from, and I'm wondering if that as a matrix of information can still be acknowledged visually in the sense of a diff, but it may not follow. It may be like a new model of the diff in a sense. What do you think about that as a thought?
Yeah, I don't think that the solution, unless we're talking about a document representation of the graph, we could rely on diffing the same way that you can in GitHub or other tools like that. But one of the challenges I was going to raise, but it gets to like the whole of the triple. So a triple changes. Yeah, and so one of the challenges I was going to bring up that I think we discussed on a previous call was languages. So in the case where we acknowledged that language isn't evenly dealt with across all data sets, but you could imagine a SCOS preferred label in a particular language has changed, but not in another. So we need to be able to recognize all the way down to the language tags. And so it seems like the challenge here is about, or Jesse, I think it's related to what you're saying, but that our techniques might need to be different than we would in a sort of file-based strategy.
Yeah, that great point. And that's what I'm wondering about. Like we are asking the same question for sure. And I think it has, I'm wondering if there's and I think in that last meeting we also talked about if we could, this is where the complications, I think, if we could arrive at the work outside of the graph to define what we're actually looking for in the graph, somehow that would define what is changed. And I think that's going to be the complication in terms of, you know, going down to these things of languages, variants, and issues that have been added in or deleted or changed, etc. I think that that's definitely where we're going to have a lot of, at least theoretically, some kind of work outside the graph to determine what those differences are. And you're basically pinpointing the same issue. But you're right, the traditional diff is not going to work, and that's definitely clear. But how to get down to it is that thing. And so I don't know if that's like, we're just going to rely on AI to come in the future, you know, which of course we're going to write or whatever. But anyway, thanks.
So I have a quick question for you, Jesse. Is the sort of use case you're trying to solve is the one where it's the human processing, so that there's particular kinds of changes you're interested in, and so you're looking for something visual that might make it easier for a human to pick out the information as opposed to processing sort of a long stream?
Yeah, in the long stream, we would expect the various updates to have been made and the graph being changed and the data is being, you know, overwritten with those things just sort of in the background. We don't, and that's for the machine to operate. And so we would need to export that data or deal with that data in some contexts. But the question would have to do with how the human is getting the notification of that change. And I know that we're going back to that activity stream thing in a sense, but I'm also curious about how, if you're interested in setting up, let's say, a subscription model where you're interested in like getting certain kinds of sub data points, languages, or whatever it is you're interested in, tracked, then trying to figure out what that would need to look like for the user to quickly understand what has changed so that they can make a change locally if needs be, or whatever they need to do. Express something in a policy maybe that was affected by a label change, if it's something that's like related to a certain type of collection in which metadata is being produced for, etc. So I'm just wondering about how we're going to get these notifications, because we all know we want notifications, but then we're trying to figure out how to notify in a way that's like meaningful and relatively efficient for the metadata person to look at and say, yes, change has been made, and I know why, or I know what. Maybe both. So I just thinking out loud here. You know, one of the questions.
Yeah, I do wonder if this is not like on the far end. So when I envision this space, I think of, there are change document creators. So the authorities, they've made changes, they create documents that express those changes. And then there's the downstream consumer of those documents. And that downstream consumer could be a machine that fully processes it for a full cache, or it could be a tool that is set up to do some pre-processing to be able to display it to a human. And I think I want to add one more role, something about notifications, because that seems like a separate piece.
Got it. And David just made comment that he has done something open source diffs for RDF graphs. So I don't know if that's something, David, that you want to add to the notes somehow, or send to Lynette to add to the notes. I'm not sure.
Well, that wasn't
Or
me.
too
Really,
early
just
for that.
me doing a Google search. There's
Okay,
actually,
yeah, just to search. Got it.
yeah, there's a page on the W3C website on how to diff RDF, and there are
Can you
Yeah.
post that link in the chat and I'll copy it over?
Sure thing.
I'm not trying to start a rabbit hole here, but it, you know, it is something that came up before, and we are looking at sort of figuring out how people can, because people will want to track these things, and this is sort of a change management issue relative to workflows. So I just don't want to, I don't want to throw it away or whatever, you know, even though it may be downstream quite a bit. It's still something that I don't want to forget about.
So I think we're talking here of the authorities provider not only providing the updated data, the change graph, but also supplying information as to indicate what has changed, so that people can pick and choose, or systems can pick and choose and decide whether they need to process a particular change or not. And I'm wondering, is there some ontology or some kind of standard vocabulary that is used for communicating that kind of information?
That's a good question.
So the question was, is there a vocabulary to communicate the changes in general,
The kind of
specific changes,
change,
the
yeah,
kind
what
of changes?
type of change has occurred? So
Well,
you
sorry, go on.
go ahead, Ken.
I was going to say that, so activity streams actually accommodates this feature functionality. Let me see if I can quickly find the link. But
I actually have a
activity
page that describes that.
Right, the activity streams has a sidecar vocabulary, which is linked to off of the main spec documentation. So you might not find it immediately. Here's the link to the vocabulary. Activity types. I'm going to plop this in the chat. Where am I going with this? Oh, so you'll see on the activity types. So let me back this up and say it this way. Activity streams was, designed for like social purposes, how to communicate changes between social applications, things like Twitter, Facebook. So you got things like dislike and like and ignore and follow and flag. But it nevertheless has a list of activity types that are relatively generic, and they do include things like add and create and delete, remove, update. But if we have an activity type that is not encompassed by the activity streams vocabulary, because activity streams is serialized as JSON LD and is essentially RDF, you are at liberty, we are at liberty, anyone is at liberty to create their own activity types. Just need a URI, really. So, does that answer?
Yeah, that's
Well,
that
I should
sounds,
say, I think it provides an answer for activity streams. I don't know if it provides the general answer that we're all looking for, but I hope it provides the answer, at least if we were to be looking harder at activity streams eventually.
It's helpful to me, but let me ask this question, and that is, it seems like that obviously you're working on this specifically for ID, and it seems like that. So let's say FAST, which exports, some files of changes, right? They're files of changes. And what are they currently in the form of? Well, I'm wondering if actually this is the kind of thing that could eventually make it into FAST and or even like art and architecture thesaurus, where you're thinking about, locally implemented. Now because it's a common standard, right? The activity stream is a common standard. So I'm just wondering if it's the kind of thing that could eventually start. Oh yeah, definitely close the window. Sorry. Anyway, but the somebody was anyway. The comment here is just to have to do with whether or not that could be implemented across various vocabularies, in which what those changes were made could then be defined, like in terms of what the vocabulary is, the local vocabulary. So I'm just curious, like this could be a growing thing, honestly. I mean, obviously you're doing a giant test bed of a significant quantity of vocabularies, Kevin and crew. And so just thinking this could be something that could spread, honestly, in a very helpful way once, does that seem logical to other people?
Are we backing into a process ontology here?
Oh, I don't know.
Can you say a little more about that, Dave?
Well, I mean, if we're modeling the types of changes, what we're really doing is, well, in this case, it's just JSON, but the prospect is you're actually attempting to formalize the processes and the nature of those processes, which is basically an ontology construction exercise. I'm not saying I'm encouraging this, it's just the prospect of we are slowly ooching in that direction as we start getting into formal representation of this stuff.
So Dave, do you have a problem with that? Because I'm looking at this in terms of mesh, and I'm thinking, well, so we update mesh once a year. I think we're going to twice a year. And we mainly what mesh does is delete things. And then we have mesh RDF, and it would be really nice to be able to show in mesh RDF that this term was deleted or changed. But I guess, so my question is, how do you, in regard to what you're asking, do you see this as a bad thing?
No, just a cautionary note that look how long it took the community to agree on BibFrame as an ontology for the catalog. It's just anytime you get two ontologists in the room together, they cannot agree. So just
I'm laughing.
It's a bumper sticker waiting to happen.
yeah, the number of preferences to the number of ontologists is always n+1.
That's why I was hoping that there is an existing one that we can just use, and we spare ourselves the pain of trying to go through such a process.
Well, there might be, because there are a lot of ontologies out there, and I suspect that there might be procedural ontologies that are lurking out there, given the other stuff I get exposed to in the biomedical domain. So it might be worth some exploration just to see if there's something that exists as low-hanging fruit that wouldn't require a lot of editing or reconceptualization.
So are you seeing this as something that would be in place of the types of data that we're working on defining right now, that you think something's out there that might already have these kinds of definitions?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. And I confess I'm not an ontologist. I only play one on occasion. But
Yeah. So I wonder if someone has time where they would be willing to do a little looking around between now and our next meeting to see if there is something out there.
Yeah, go ahead, please go ahead.
When you say whether there's something out there in terms of a list of possible activity types that would be fitting for what we're discussing?
So what I was hearing folks express, I've been sort of going down this path of looking at moving towards activity streams, but I didn't want to box us into one approach right off. But it sounds like even within activity streams that there are different ways to sort of express changes, and that given that it is compatible with JSON LD, that if we had an ontology that already expresses changes like we're talking about, then maybe that would give us an infrastructure to sort of hang these changes off of, where we don't have to quite create the entire specification.
Yeah, it gives us a model to think about actual use in.
I would think specifically in terms of like a best approach for expressing changes in RDF. Because some of these challenges that we discussed earlier are specific to changes in graphs, especially this first one where, it may go through several levels in the graph to actually get to the data you want to change. How do you express that? And I would wonder if there's an ontology out there that already addresses some of that.
Well, I have two comments. One, sorry that I opened this big can of worms. That's one comment. So, which is totally cool in the sense of like it probably needed to be handled at some point. But I think I'd be happy to start looking at this. When is our next meeting? How much time until our next meeting?
It's 2 weeks. We're every other week.
Okay, cool. Thanks. Yeah, let me try to dig around and try to put together some kind of framework for this, and then maybe I could present on it or whatever. Does that sound helpful to people?
Yeah, it would be helpful.
Okay. Just to figure out if it's something that we want to think about further or whatever. But I'll definitely, since I opened that can of worms, I'll deal with the can opener, so to speak, or whatever, whatever metaphor you want to use. Thanks.
I can tell you that for mesh RDF, what we had talked about doing, and I'm not sure they were able to implement it. But what we had talked about doing was for things that are in mesh, we deprecate, and we do it, like I said, once or twice a year. And what they've done is created mesh with a date. So you'd have a mesh term, you'd have a year, and then you would have you'd have the inside the URL you'd have a year, and that year would be, this is the year it ended, this is the year that the date was no longer active. So we don't do, so it's not I don't think it's a formal, I hesitate to say that we do something that's really, that we make a big deal out of those, or that they're formal. But that's how we're supposed to be showing that something is no longer active, or it was active to a certain year and now it's no longer active. I don't know if that's at all helpful, Jesse, but I'm just thinking maybe that's one less you have to spend a lot of time on.
Yeah, thanks. Go ahead.
I was just going to ask Nancy, do you have a link to something that expresses those, what the format of that document is?
I can look, and if I can find it, I'll put it in, or I'll send it to you. I would have to look at Mesh RDF and look around to see. And part of the reason I say that is because I'm not entirely sure. We had talked about implementing that when we first went live with Mesh RDF. And since then, I know that they had some problems, and that may be one of the problems that they had, was figuring out exactly how to show that those things were deprecated. Those terms were deprecated.
Okay, I do have this page that is trying to capture like various organizations and how they're handling change management stuff. So existing change management approaches. If you have anything you want to add, like I did just quickly plop in a section for mesh, and I really didn't capture much of what you said. I can listen to the tape later and add to that. But if you have information, Nancy, that you want to add in this section that sort of expresses how you guys do change management, I think understanding what the field is and how people are doing it is also part of our process, and not just what information we want to include in our change management documents, but how people are actually doing that already. And so, Jesse, that's where I feel like the direction you're talking about very much fits in this. It'll inform some of the choices about how we express this. So this is
Yeah,
good.
thanks. Well, thank you. I'll go into it next couple of weeks. I mean, over the next couple of weeks, I'll have something prepared for us. So
Yeah, thanks, Lynette. I'll see what I can add there.
Great, thank you. And again, just to orient you, everybody, you can get to this from the working documents. All the documents that we talk about are there, and this is the existing change management approaches.
also, don't hesitate to share whatever you find. If you're looking for information about mesh updates and things like this, you can also share those things in Slack too. Depends on how you want it to be. Either way, but if you want it to like go direct, Slack is also cool for me. But personal preference there.
Yeah, and Slack is a great place to have conversations about something. So if you want some like immediate feedback and hear what other people think about what you're posting, that's great. And I do kind of watch places like that. And if you know, I feel like we're having a conversation that needs to be captured in the notes, I will definitely move some of those conversations over.
Cool. Thank you, everybody.
So I did make one change based on some of the challenges that we had where it says predicate. I did put in perhaps we should be using an LD path instead. But some of that's going to depend on where we land. If we're doing JSON LD, maybe you express sort of a portion of the graph. So I'm wondering, I kind of feel like this stuff around the labels in my mind needs to sit for a while, and sort of I need to think about it and see what some of the other information is that we bring in from other sources. And I'm wondering about switching back up to some of the earlier pieces for new and maybe delete, and see if we can nail a few things down there. Are folks okay with moving in that direction?
Seems fine.
So we did talk about new a little bit last time, and we basically expressed two possible approaches. One was that it's new and you provide the URI, and then the consumer is expected to dereference the URI to get the new information about that URI. And the other was that you say it's new, you highlight the URI, and then you provide the graph associated with that URI. And I just wanted to check in and see what folks thought about those two approaches, pros, cons.
I would say that option 2 is feasible, but would be an optional thing. Just because the computation of the actual entity could be expensive for the service providing the output.
Well, that's definitely the scenario we got into with the revision for the cache for question authority. It was speed versus pre-computation aspects. The payloads here, though, aren't going to be that big, are they, Lynette?
Well, I think that's highly dependent on the individual authority. The, you know, I think a lot of authorities, a new document is fairly straightforward. I mean, some do it in like a very flat way with something like SCAs. And those documents are clearly not going to be huge, but if the change that's happening is in a work that's in BibFrame documents can be quite large, but it is a single entity at a time. So Kevin, is there a particular scenario in which you would envision that the graph that's created for a single new entity where it might be computationally unfeasible?
Well, I guess I'm just speaking from somewhat from experience. So, we have the Atom feed at ID, and in theory, the Atom feed would allow you to embed a resource. We've resisted that again, principally for the performance reason. When you start having to provide, pages of 20 to 50 resources, all of which have been fully computed, it just gets expensive. And this is for a website that gets updated daily. So yes, we do have a cache out in front, but for things like this, it gets invalidated on a daily basis. So that first hit will be a little hard. But the other reason we do this is because you find yourself asking, you find yourself in a conversation about what is a full entity? What is a full entity? Does it include all the links, incoming and outgoing? One. Two, here in this example, you have reduced the options, the serialization options, down to JSON LD. But with a service like ID, we've fielded requests of, couldn't we just stick the mark XML in the Atom feed, or couldn't we stick the RDF in the Atom feed, or couldn't we stick the N triples in the Atom feed? Point being is you've limited the options to JSON LD, which is good. But like I said, from the other reasons beyond just some performance questions, you find yourself in these discussions about what is a full entity, and then what serializations should you include? Do you include the MADS RDF and the SCOS, just the SCOS, just the MADS RDF? I don't know. Anyway, long story short is if including the entity is optional, you can stop the conversation quickly.
I have a question for you, Kevin, actually. And it goes back to this issue of JSON LD. When you're working with activity streams, it's sort of like for these, you're not using JSON LD, right? You're using Mark XML. What are you doing? Because I just only ask because JSON LD is definitely something that W3 is all about. So I just don't know, you've already made some changes for your LC needs?
No, as of right now, we've made no changes. Well, correct. We've made no changes to, how do I say this? Whatever we plan on doing right now should be fully conformant with the activity stream spec, and that is our goal. I said earlier that the serialization of activity streams is JSON LD. I think I still may be correct about that, but I shared the link and I was looking at it a second ago, and activity streams does have its own special media type, and it is not JSON LD, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's still not actually JSON LD. So I just wanted to clarify that it does have its own media type. But to get back to your question, Jesse, as of right now, anything we produce with respect to activity streams, I expect it to be in conformance with the spec.
Thank you. That's very helpful, and that it definitely makes things simpler for us to not want to try to fork things and redefine everything. So thank you so much.
Right. The one question that I don't have a good answer to right now, that won't be will still be conforming with the spec, but it starts to get into that area where how do we need to customize the output a little bit, and that has to do with the activity type. So one of the first things that we want to do is provide an activity stream for when a label changes. In the generic, and I'm going to say this without having actually looked super closely, but I do not believe the generic activity types will cover sufficiently the specific type of change that we want to communicate. So we want to communicate that there's been a label change. And if you look at the list of activity types, I don't see one there that would nicely double for what we want to do. So we might have to generate our own specific type, although that could be an output of this group, a list of types that are specific to sharing resources in a library context or library vocabulary context or library data context.
Yeah, I could definitely see that being part of the output for sure. And I want to just do a little bit of a second on the part where you said, what is a full entity? What do we mean by that? Where are the edges of the graph? That was a huge question for me when we were talking about label change, which is simpler than like a whole entity. I still think there's anytime you're going to provide a graph that goes in different directions, it's, it's hard to know where those edges are. So it sounded like, Kevin, that your thoughts on this would be that that both options might be the way that we would need to support this, and that the individual authority would decide for themselves whether or not they would include the entity as part of a new a document for a new entity.
That seemed to be the most, providing the most liberty to the implementation side of it.
Any other thoughts on new? Is this pretty comfortable for folks? Or
Yeah, I do have one other comment about dealing with new, and that is determining the relevancy of the new entity that is being added to the data set. If you are a full cache, then everything is relevant. Anything that is new is relevant. But if you are partial cache, or a system that does partial cache, or if you are an individual library and you are being notified of all these new entities being added to this authority file, you have to decide whether it is something that is of interest to your organization or your system, and how to determine that. In the scenario of a library that has contracted with a vendor to provide authority service, we are paying the vendor to keep track of headings that previously had no match. And when a new match becomes available, we rely on them to notify the library and provide a copy of that entity. But in other situations, one question that we might need to think about is whether it's the downstream consumer's responsibility to determine whether the new entity is something that is relevant to their situation, or whether the notification that is coming from the authority provider could include that information.
Can you say that last part again? I'm not sure what information, when you say included the information, what information is that?
Well, let's say the authority provider knows that, okay, this is a previously unmatched heading, and now there's an authority record for it. And that information can be communicated. But that is specific to a situation where, the authority provider and the the receiver, they have a particular kind of relationship, and they have information about, what is relevant to that receiving library.
Okay, so I would just like does OCLC do this for you now? Like if something becomes available, you get a notification?
No, but our authority vendor does.
And what format do they send that in?
They would let us know that there's a new heading that matches a previously unmatched heading, and they would provide the authority record, and we would load it.
So do they send that as
So-
an email?
They send it, yeah, they send both a report and the actual entity description.
Right, this is an intermediate third party that provides a service between an authority and a consumer. So they get information from the authority provider, but they also get information from the library about their library holdings. And as Vita said, they're trying to find matches between the bibliographic data in the library's catalog and authorities created externally and make those connections. And when there isn't a connection to be made because there's the absence of an authority, when an authority becomes available, the intermediary service knows about the library's descriptions to be able to know that that library needs to pay attention to a specific edition.
So I wonder if one of you could document on that existing change management page something about like what that looks like, whether it's an email, what format, what is the data, what does the data look like when you get it? How do you know? That kind of information. That would be good to know how that's processed as well.
I can do that. Which page are you
It's
referring to?
the existing change management page.
Okay, thank you.
You get to it from working documents and you just look for existing change management approaches.
Got it.
And I think that I would say to that, that we have those of us who are, or those institutions that own an authority and are updating an authority, cannot reach out. I mean, it just seems to me impossible. Maybe Kevin can comment on this, but it just seems to me impossible to attempt to reach out to every group who's using that authority and I think having a third party intermediary or the library itself tracking what changes they want and what changes they need to include or not include is really up to the library. I think we provide the authorities, but I don't know that it's our job to say you should grab this or you should not.
I agree. And I'm also thinking about a situation like Sinopia, which has a database and it has these entities that have labels that may not have a matching authority at the time of creation. And later on, a new record comes along that could fit that role, and but something needs to be to happen in order for that systems to know, either by it actively trying to monitor some kind of authority data stream, or by getting a notification from a provider that there's now a useful entity description that can be included.
It's interesting to me. This is really actually an important conversation. I'm actually wondering if we might not see, and probably you're already thinking the same thing, and that is that if there would not be, like, the service providers that are currently doing things mostly in MARC would just want to move to this, or at least look at this as a model for their own notifications for their clients that they have. when they're moving to this RDF based metadata world. And so I'm just wondering if this is like going to be part of the new model of what the service providers are doing, and that they're actually part of the intermediary to manage that sheer quantity of updating happening on the sort of source vocabulary file, for your local needs. They just may be what they're going to do in terms of like, a pay-per-play service or whatever.
So I think this is actually a good place to stop. We only have like 2 minutes left. So I think that next time I would like to jump right into looking at delete and see if we can move through a few more, maybe delete and deprecated, and see if we can move through those. And I think the issues that are being brought up are excellent. And I'm really looking forward to seeing some of the existing change management strategies filled out on that page. So I want to thank everybody again for participating and having such a great conversation. And I'll see you in 2 weeks.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Thanks, Lynette.